Welcome everybody. You can now see a lot of names. I don't expect everybody to be switching on their screens, but it's nice to see some familiar names, some less familiar, but good to see you all. I am going to, I think, kick off. We're bang on time, 1 minute past 1. So my name is Samantha Hardingham. I'm the academic director at the LSA. Really nice to see a big mix of students, LSA students, non-LSA students, practice network members, and also some non-members possibly, which is fantastic that you have all found us here back online, which feels a little bit strange, but actually just brilliant that we can all use this a little bit more in a more relaxed fashion now. Really pleased to be resuscitating, I should say, or resurrecting what were previously called Tuesday talks and are now called Thursday talks, catchily, but very easy to know when they happen. Always Thursday lunchtimes, sometimes Thursday evenings, but 1 o'clock on Thursdays are where we are. So really pleased to be bringing that back into our world. It really, it was a sort of series that was really developed by our key supporters at the LSA Practice Network, and the content, all of the speakers and guests who are presenting work over the course of the series really comes out of responses to a survey that we carried out with LSA students network, our Member Plus Practice Network members. And really just sort of looking at how we could develop pieces of content that were relevant to you, subject matters that were very present in your studios and certainly in ours. So that's where our themes are coming from. And if you all have other interests that you'd like to feed into those themes, please do let us know, particularly John Nahar, our engagement manager, who I think pretty well all of you will have come across at some point or other. And if you haven't, please get in touch with him. So this week, without further ado, we have what I would like to call our very own Jack Penford-Baker. Jack is senior architect at Haptic, so is not really just ours, but is a senior architect at Haptic, but is also teaching on our second year at the LSA, design tutor. So we're very, very pleased to have Jack on the faculty team. And Jack is joined by Harry Sumner, a sustainability consultant. Hi, Harry, working in the Haptic Green team, which is the research and development arm of Haptic. Really in line with the LSA's drive to explore kind of more international design methodologies, where we fit in London in relation to the rest of the world. This talk will explore a range of projects, one particularly in London, a mass timber community centre in the heart of London King's Cross, due for completion this summer. And another, which is the urban rehabilitation of an area in the heart of Bergen in Norway. And Jack and Harry will discuss how their in-house sustainability teams make use of internal research into practice collaboration, knowledge sharing, really to embed sustainable design principles throughout the work, from initial briefing stage to design, through to construction and post-occupation evaluation. So we're really, certainly from a school point of view and my particular perspective, from an academic perspective, really pleased to be hosting these talks. It's highly relevant subject matter to our master's students, where we talk a lot about how to embed not only sustainable principles, but many other design principles into design thesis questions, and then see how that plays out in or is demonstrated in an architectural proposal. So really looking forward to hearing from you both. We will run Jack and Harry will speak for about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then there'll be time for some questions following the talk. So without further ado, over to you both. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Sam, and thanks for the invite. It's really nice to be able to talk today. So what I'll do is I'll just quickly share my screen and get this presentation up. And here we go. Hey, hopefully you should all be able to see my screen now. I'll just make that full screen. So yes, welcome everyone. I thought I'd just start off by introducing Haptic as a practice. So we formed around 13 years ago by really a series of friends from university that kind of came together and decided to kind of go out on their own, so to speak, and set up what is now known as, well, is Haptic. This is us from the summer. Out in Oslo, having a very nice time, but a very kind of important time to sort of meet with our fellow colleagues around our different offices. And that sort of summarizes a little bit about us as a practice. So we're around 45 to 50 people in total. We're based in London, Oslo, and also more recently in Bilbao. Our work kind of bridges both all three of these locations, but also further afield, both within the UK, Norway, and around the world as well. I guess the real sort of purpose of the talk today kind of comes from a conversation I was having with John about the topic, and really looking at this idea of, you know, sustainability, the importance that it plays within the work that we do, the impact that we have within our profession as architects and designers. But really wanting to sort of acknowledge that there's a whole range and raft of approaches, and there isn't necessarily a right or wrong. It's about a direction of travel that we're going in as a profession to really try and help tackle this. And part of this is that, you know, I'm sure you're all aware of you know, some of the larger practices within the UK and some of the fantastic work that they're doing in terms of research, developing tools. But Haptic as an office, which is classed as kind of small to medium size, we're not necessarily able to sort of build on that sort of wealth of experience within a sort of a wide range of, say, an office of 200 people. But we kind of asked ourselves a little bit around how can we actually truly embed sustainable design within our practice, bearing in mind the nature of our office. So really what happens is, you know, the overarching element of the practice is Haptic, and we're one family. And then this element of sustainability and how we look to sort of embed that within the practice. And actually a third and really, really important factor for us is this notion of collaboration. And being a smaller to medium-sized practice means that we've really got to expand beyond the remit of how we operate and look to learning and sharing within our wider network, because it's really only truly great kind of leaps will be taken in terms of minimizing carbon uses, reducing energy uses, trying to reduce the overall impact on the environment, is by working together collaboratively. And so those sort of themes really came together. And a few years ago, Haptic Green was created initially as a sort of a starting place of research in the practice, but it's kind of grown and evolved to become a real core element. So I'm just going to pass over to Harry, who is our sustainability consultant, just to give a little bit of an overview of how Haptic as a company embeds sustainability within the way that we work. I'll pass over to you now, Harry.
Sure. Hi, everybody. So I'll sort of take a little bit step back and go to the why first, why we need to kind of look at this. And it comes from what Jack said about the trajectory of the industry and why we should be looking at this more sort of integrated approach to design. Obviously, everybody's aware of this now, I'm sure. We're in a climate and biodiversity emergency, and we have these kind of commitments that are made both at sort of practice level for many people, but then also obviously at national level and also at city and district levels now, to become net zero carbon by various points in time. And so our role as designers is really has a big influence on this. So they say around 40%, 42% of emissions can be influenced by our roles within the built environment. And so there really is no place for an unsustainable building anymore. So how do we kind of adapt our design process to acknowledge this and ensure that we're safeguarding the sort of buildings that we're designing? The commitments that we've made, this you might have seen before, is from the International Energy Agency's recent predictions about the sort of targets that have been set at national level and whether we're going to achieve them. And so it's not just a case of continuing with the same trajectory, but actually we have to keep increasing the trajectory to sort of get to net zero carbon by those targets that we've really set. So we are almost not working hard enough just yet. And so that's really where this talk, I think, comes in. And so looking at the kind of traditional model or a typical model for how we design buildings in terms of organizationally, architects are often the kind of lead designer with lots of input from different consultants, and they kind of bring these elements together, and it's lots of back and forth between the architect and various different consultants and specialists. But today we're kind of looking at a slightly different approach that's becoming more relevant, which is the architect having some in-house capability where it becomes more integrated, and you bring some of these roles a little bit closer to the design process. Jack, you can go to next, which is what we as Haptic have. So similarly, as many firms are now taking in BIM as well and have other capabilities. Sustainability is the one that we're looking at today, but how we bring this in-house and sort of closing that gap between consultant and architect and make that translation into design more prevalent and more efficient and effective. And so it's not just us that are doing this, of course, and many big firms, as Jack said, have been doing this for a long time, but also a lot of the small and medium-sized engineers are also beginning to have their own in-house capability for sustainability. And so if everybody is getting this slightly greater capability within that design chain, the product at the end must be better. That's the idea. And so this is where Haptic Green comes in. We are the sustainability team, but also research and development that is embedded within Haptic. So as a practice, we also have made declarations both in the UK and for our Norway office as well. And we've set ourselves the challenge of adhering to the RIBA 2030 climate challenges, but also as a practice to achieve carbon neutral status by 2030. And so Haptic Green comes directly into trying to achieve some of these goals that we've set, but also covers a few different areas. So Jack, if you can. You sit within the practice, so the core at the centre is the team, and as Jack pointed out, we're only a small or medium-sized practice, and so we don't have a really large team or sort of a lot of resource to put into this, but actually a small team can have a significant impact on the wider practice when we bring in lots of sort of initiatives and different ways of interacting with the practice and then the wider network. So really the most important part of this diagram, which shows how we interact with the practice and then the wider network, is actually that middle ring where everybody who works within Haptic interacts with Haptic Green and vice versa. And so we get impact across projects and across knowledge sharing and ensuring that everybody feels comfortable with the changes that we have to make to design more sustainably in the long term. So it's that core center where Haptic Green interacts with Haptic as a whole in the design chain, and that's what we're really looking at today. We have 5 key workflows for Haptic Green, which we see as sort of encompassing of our role. The first and arguably the most important is design and how we influence the existing design processes that go on in the practice. But then it's about internal knowledge transfer, ensuring that everything that we know already as a practice, new people, existing members of staff, and also throughout our different offices from Norway and from the office in Bilbao, what knowledge we can bring and retain within the practice and then deploy to when relevant to different projects to ensure we get the best and most sustainable outcome. Then practice operations, which is about, like I said, our goal to become carbon neutral by 2030. So how do we actually reduce our own operation whilst also continuing to design sustainably and operate as a practice? And then the last two work really closely together. So it's about research and development and spending time to sort of speculate research through design and think about different approaches that we could be taking on projects in the future. For example, the Oslo Tower, which Jack will go through later, but also about current challenges and how we can really deploy this research into projects, which is where academia comes in. So really interrogating the projects that we have doing or that we are doing and trying to get some sort of tangible benefit in the sort of short and medium term. So those are our 5 key workflows. And I guess the question, like Jack said, is why. So we've had the why, but now it's about what is the why of embedding the sustainability into the existing design process. There's 3 sort of key reasons I see. So the first is about the commitments. This is probably the most important one. So in terms of the sort of REBA timeline and when the way that we design to REBA stages, the biggest commitments generally are made early in the design process. And that's what we have found as a practice, is that we make the biggest kind of, hopefully the best moves, but also often historically, people can also make the biggest mistakes as well at the start of projects, and commitments are made that then have to be continued throughout the project. And actually safeguarding, the main aim of us within the design process is to actually safeguard those decisions at the beginning, which is the second one. So it's about ensuring that we give ourselves the scope for the decision that we can influence right at the beginning as architects, in the facade and in materiality and all these, the massing and all these kind of things that get fixed. We ensure that they are decisions that are going to sort of withstand the length of the project, and that by the end we get the outcome that we want, which is a really sustainable building. And the last one is that actually our role isn't just about that initial kind of phase, but actually we, by being embedded in the practice, have kind of influence throughout the whole life of the building. And the challenge of actually creating a sustainable building doesn't stop once we've done the technical design, but it goes right through to construction and post-occupancy. And so being able to do that and have that influence throughout the whole life of the project is really important. So the last bit I'll do is about just the how, the sort of tangible how we embed it into our existing design process at Haptic. So there's a sort of a cyclical process that we have got, which is about initially setting really clear targets right at the early stages. And we aim as high as possible when we're doing this, because we understand that the reality of projects is that budget and various other things will try and knock these targets back. So we try and be as ambitious as possible to begin with, and deploy the sustainability principles that we know will work right from the beginning, right at the feasibility stage. Again, locking in the decisions that are going to influence how that building performs when it actually goes through to concept and then detailed design later on. Then, whilst we're actually designing, there's the opportunity to analyze, test, and allow that to really inform the decisions that we can control, the facade and all these other things. And then finally, it's about the most important parts, arguably, are the last 4, which is about reviewing what we have done, evaluating, and then feeding that back in to close the loop to ensure that we just get consistently better outcomes as we go forward. So Jack, if you want to go to. So about setting targets, for us, we have come up with our own set of kind of parameters that we as Haptic want to design to, and these are our key focuses. And we have targets for a lot of these which align with the REBA 2030 challenge, but then also our own internal aspirations for energy, for circularity, and all of these different elements that we think are crucial to actually a sort of total performance for the building at the end. But to make this kind of more manageable, we've one of the things we've done internally is that we have now a design guide that helps us to actually deploy these at really early stages. So from feasibility to stage 2 or 3, we have checklists that allow us to go back and ensure that we're safeguarding those decisions that we can, and we're also we're questioning where necessary consultants' decisions to make sure that we're really getting the most out of the projects. right from the beginning. Second was to actually deploy these kind of sustainable design principles right from the beginning. And so even when we do feasibilities or sort of initial concept design, it's about trying to embed those principles as early as possible so that they are safeguarded and become part of the narrative of the building as it develops. Again, seeing how allowing these principles that we've come up with early on sort of to develop and see how they actually influence the architecture itself, rather than becoming something that is a back and forth between us designing and then a consultant to try and come and make it work from an environmental perspective. Actually, we allow some of the principles to be right there from sort of day one, first discussion, this is what we're going to aim for, and it becomes part of the narrative of the building. Then we're able to use analysis where possible. So this is where it becomes more technical, and our capabilities are even more important at this stage, because it's about live analysis that works in parallel with the design process that's going on, to then feed in and inform design decisions. So here you can see we're looking at facade analysis, looking at solar gain, and ensuring that we have the right parameters set up in our facade design to ensure that when we come to later stages, this building is actually performing as we want it to, and we haven't made any commitments that are going to detrimentally impact the building later in its life. And really, just as much as possible, integrating this into the workflow and making this sort of agile approach to analysis. So when we do this, is an example of just GAs thinking about how daylight impacts it. If we had a consultant doing this, the sort of time frame would be so much longer than just a really quick process of analyze, reassess, and then inform design and change, and then assess again. And so in that sense, this is the most important part of our role in the design process. Is once we've secured the initial strategies, it's then about really how can we allow analysis to inform design throughout. And so there's another one final example of that. It's just the same process again, is just agility. So when we're modeling in the very initial stages at feasibility, we can still be thinking about those sustainable design principles to ensure that we don't commit to anything that doesn't work in future, and actually we come out with a much better outcome that has a more informed design intent. So that's the last, And then I think the final one is just about employing that sort of 360 degree inquisitive approach. So we are not sort of kind of precious about the projects. We in this element, in this sort of kind of quantifiable stage where we begin to review the projects, we have to be really open and transparent and really inquisitive about what has happened, what we have done, and what we could have done better. And that is how we sort of close that loop and allow future projects to benefit from any findings of the projects that we have completed. And in that sense, Jack, if you go to the next one, the final bit is that we take that knowledge and we share it between the practice, and we ensure that we document it so we don't miss any lessons learned. So these two to do with residential and construction, but the idea being that we feed everything back, because people are working across offices and across different projects at different scales. And we want to ensure that when we come to start the next residential project, we are able to already skip through some of the testing phase and understand what worked really well in the past and what gave us the best outcome, to really kind of springboard the design process the next time. And so in that sense, it all kind of closes the loop, and hopefully the idea being we just continually get more sustainable and more impressive outcomes. And then, oh, sorry, I forgot. Yeah, so as Jack already said, collaboration is key for us as small and medium-sized practices. That's something that we've found incredibly important. So on that diagram that I showed at the beginning, Jack, if you go to the last slide, it's that outer network ring. We've found that we are in discussions with, I don't know how many different sort of universities, different practices of similar scale, but also larger practices, constantly, and the idea being that we discuss things across the whole range from design, operation, through to materials and research, and that is really where the most sort of I would say the biggest acceleration in information comes from, is about through that collaboration network, and I think for small and medium sized practices that is the only way to really sort of keep ahead with the way that the industry has to change.
Great, thanks, Harry. I kind of want to just, before I kind of go on and show a few examples of projects from in-house at Haptic, I just wanted to dwell a little bit on, the work that Harry does for us and the wider sort of Haptic Green team in the practice. As architects, we have to do a lot, and we are all trying kind of to do as best we can in terms of creating a sustainable future in the buildings and spaces and places that we design. But you always get bogged down and you can't do everything at once. And I, first-hand experience working with Harry on projects in the office just gives you that sort of that ability to just react quicker and accelerate that sort of trajectory of trying to achieve net zero and go beyond that to really prevent any like lasting harmful damage beyond what we've already doing and kind of intending to do in the next few years. So it just really is as a fundamental part of the way that we're operating right now, which I think works incredibly well. And it's a really simple model, but it's one that's incredibly beneficial. And so what I wanted to do is just take you through a few schemes where Harry's kind of touched on some projects in more detail from Haptic Green's perspective, but from an architecture side, I wanted to kind of pull up a couple of these projects where they kind of exist within that sort of world and that system diagram that Harry was showing. So the first project, this is an interpractice one in Bergen in Oslo. And it really comes from this idea of collaboration. So out of the 2016 referendum and Brexit, there was a sort of a conversation had between, several friends and peers within the London sort of architecture network, who really sort of missed the fact that we're leaving the continent and wanted to really sort of continue a relationship with Europe. And beyond, really. So what was formed out of that was this kind of network called Londonon, which includes ourselves, Haptic, Morrison Company, Gort Scott, Turner Works, Piercy & Co, Elliott Wood, and May Architects, and I believe a couple of others as well. So forgive me if I've kind of missed any off. But really is a sort of a way to research and learn from places outside of the UK. But at the end of a few years of doing that and in lockdown, it kind of become, well, we kind of still want to work out in Europe and abroad. And so we kind of looked at opportunities and competitions that align to the sort of collective values, and we begin to sort of enter into them. So this is a competition that we did a couple of years ago now in Bergen. It's on a side of the city, which is, as you can see from this image on the top right, there's this huge sort of mountain or hill that casts this kind of big dominant shadow across the other side of the city. And so it's a little bit unloved. This is the sort of more industrial part of the city, lots of sort of shipbuilding heritage that exists there. And the competition was essentially around creating a new neighborhood, a large urban scale master plan for the site, which thankfully we did end up winning collectively as a group. And it was really down to our sort of approach from the beginning. And as Harry mentions, around those sort of first principles. For this scheme, the kind of core element was about retention and reuse of existing building stock. So a lot of other competitors kind of came in and got rid of a lot and made these massive moves. And we approached it from the perspective of, okay, wait, let's start at the beginning and actually see how many of these existing buildings can we retain? How many are in sort of like good enough condition that their structure will kind of go on beyond their sort of current lifespan? And then looking at ways that we could use kind of subtle interventions, almost like urban acupuncture, to just slightly tweak to enable kind of better public space and transform what is in essence already quite a lively community over there on this site. And then beyond that, look at how we can bolster what is already there through new build, but again looking at low carbon led design and structure to install what you can see here. So anything in blue is an existing structure. The yellow elements are extensions and onfills, or the lighter yellow, sorry, and the sort of bolder yellow, these are new buildings added in. They're either replacing old buildings that are completely unusable, or are just kind of actually intensifying and densifying the space. Then overlaying the sort of program and really wanting to get this idea of a mixed use typology across the site. And the final thing really is driven around making a place habitable and accessible. So moving the shift away from vehicular movement and moving more towards active measures of travel around the site, and greening that site as well, so that a pedestrian and bike friendly space is created. So these are just some of the sort of competition imagery. The project is ongoing at the moment. It's quite complex in terms of its sort of scale in the city and its importance. But this sort of shows that sort of reimagining of this space by just transforming what's already there to create something that is new, but it isn't necessarily an entirely sort of overhaul of exactly what was there before. And so some of the spaces, the public spaces that are created around the site, looking at ways to kind of, as I was saying, promote that sort of active travel in between these existing buildings, moving away from vehicular movement. And a big thing here was looking at access over. So because it is slightly sort of separate from the city centre, and there's this huge, enormous 1950s concrete viaduct, we've got kind of huge amount of lanes of traffic on top. And the question a lot of people kind of posed was about access and the severance of the river, the fjord. And really, lots of people looked at creating a new bridge. But we looked at it in the way of like, well, actually, there's already a bridge there. It just isn't serving a purpose for those pedestrians and cyclists. So why not just use what's already there, suspend a new lower bridge across the river to give you that access? And even take that further. So this viaduct that is not particularly loved by everyone in the city, and transform it into something that actually could be celebrated by the city. So creating an actual usable space underneath it, a dead space that isn't really used at the moment, and looking at ways that, you know, it can be transformed throughout the day from a market to just simply public space to even kind of cinema screenings in the evening. And so really trying to kind of push the idea of what we already have and reimagine its use. The second project I'll touch on is W3, which Sam mentioned at the beginning, which is a community centre in King's Cross. It's kind of one of the final pieces of the jigsaw puzzle of the decades-long master plan and development of the north of King's Cross station. And we won this competition several years ago now, and we're on site at the moment. It's due for completion this summer, which is really exciting to kind of see it be built, because it is a mass timber building with a timber facade as well. So something that is a bit of a challenge at the moment in the UK in particular is around the sort of attitude and relationship with the use of timber in our construction industry. So we're really, really pleased that we've been able to sort of navigate those complex sort of statutory requirements when it comes to the building and its use of timber. And on a fairly complicated site, we're next to a huge swathe of sort of network rail land with kind of rail lines out the back of the building, and be able to sort of create what is, at least feels fairly modest in scale. It's a 3-story building, providing creche facilities, gym facilities, and other sort of community spaces alongside what is a beautiful new sort of landscape square within the building. And here you can see some of the visuals produced at planning stage of the main entrance into the space. And really this was all about celebrating the sustainability. And so that timber structure isn't like steel, which you're sort of wanting to hide away behind plasterboard and so on. It is an honest building. It celebrates what it's built of. And that kind of maybe an architectural approach to the look and feel of it, but it also is really about reducing material use on site. So these are just some of the images of it on site, the material palette that kind of we looked at using. And this is some of the construction shots. This is from several months back, before the externals were on. But you can see the sort of approach to construction there. There's something very pure in the way that it's pulled together, and just that timber that is making up the majority of its structure. But really the point I wanted to raise on this project, which Harry kind of touched on, is this sort of link to academia. And as a practice, we, on this project, first principle was really to push the sort of a sustainability agenda of it, and the use of mass timber throughout is kind of a real significant component of that. But we really wanted to still continue to learn and see how it can inform the next project. And so reaching out to some master's students at Westminster as part of their sort of course over there, they were tasked with sort of coming up with their own research thesis onto an existing project and collaborating with practices. And a student joined us and was looking at the W3 building and looking at the buildup and embodied carbon associated with the sort of different walls, floors, and roof finishes throughout. And what was just really fascinating here was actually from the beginning the fact that this wasn't us, this was part of our network. We weren't in control of the work they were doing in terms of the direction they were exploring. But because they had the agency to be able to kind of look at it from a university project and then actually relay their findings back to us, we had the most kind of interesting sort of discussion with them around the way they approached it was to look at different options for the different buildings, assessing the embodied carbon in each of them, and seeing how further we could have taken it. And I think that's a big sort of thing to raise here, is that we're forever learning and we're forever developing our sort of strategies and approaches to tackling the climate and biodiversity emergency that we're in. And so if we're able to sort of feed that back into the loop and accelerate it at the same time, we can be learning at a far quicker rate. That means it isn't the duration of a construction project of say 4 to 5 years that it would be built in, that we're then learning at the end of that. We're able to sort of accelerate that feedback loop. So at all stages, we're still learning and feeding into the next project to help accelerate that on. The final project I'll just touch on is, I've kind of given it this title of speculation. And, you know, for the audience today, of course, it's sort of the wider practice network, but really this being with the LSA is really, I know that a lot of, you know, students at the LSA and wider around the world, even in architecture, that speculation is this big factor of their sort of core studio work. That sort of freedom you have in a project to sort of explore ideas and themes and research. And that's really where you're able to push things beyond the sort of what is generally quite a complicated, challenging thing to navigate when it comes to the realities of a real world project. So just over sort of a year and a half ago as a practice, there was kind of a number of conversations happening around the use of mass timber, as I mentioned about W3, the relationship in the UK, but over in Oslo and in Norway, they have a slightly different attitude to the use of timber in construction. And we were looking at this idea around the intensification and the increase in density within our cities and the acceleration that's happening there. But combining that with this idea of adaptive reuse. And so taking on board the fact that we need to be moving away from a building that is a sort of cradle to grave system, that is simply there to just be built and then demolished at the end of its lifespan, because there's a huge amount of embodied carbon within that. And so looking at the fact also that 6 cities around the world have 66%, sorry, it's 5 cities have 66% of the sort of 218 skyscrapers being constructed at the moment in Europe. And with an acceleration of, I remember it was not that long ago, we just hit 50% of the global population was going to be in urban areas. And in the next 7 years, we'll be hitting 60%. So there's this real acceleration to people moving into cities and towns and our urban environments. So on top of sort of like the general retrofit and reuse of existing stock, this question around adaptive reuse, and actually rather than approaching an existing building which wasn't necessarily designed to be reused in the future, but we're able to do it, but it's still a challenge and complicated. What if you were to actually design a building with the pure intention that it could be reused in the future, when the program changes, when a city changes, when its needs and program is no longer required? And so this idea around adaptive reuse, which is not, this is talked about a lot. This isn't just a specific thing for Haptic, but what we kind of came out of this conversation was that, well, why don't we actually take a look at it as an office? Why don't we sort of give ourselves that freedom outside of having a client, having sort of other constraints that would really limit us, to really test, and in many ways I find sort of provoke a conversation in our profession and with our peers and with our clients around the idea of that, okay, if this is what our city is going to be looking like currently, lots of tall glass buildings, why are we not asking the question of building some towers like this? Why are we not looking to something that is a bit different and building out of mass timber? And we know that in the UK, if it was to be released, it would be sort of an incredibly contentious scheme, but that's really the purpose of it, because there are big conversations we need to be having. So we chose a site, a very complex site within Oslo, kind of straddles the sort of east-west boundaries of the city, and there's different demographics living in each of those areas, on top of a bridge with road network, but also waterway running through the site. You can see it here in its current form. This is it kind of over on this side here. So lots of multiple levels, big sort of gyratory running through. And we approached it with Ramble engineers to look at how we might design a building from the get-go, knowing that it would be adaptable in the future. And this concept of every third floor becoming a permanent structure, but the space in between as soft floors, so that you're able to sort of remove them, move them around, take them out if needed, depending on the program that you're putting in. And then the central core is a concrete core that is there to be permanently stay there, but still gives you enough flexibility with services being able to be pulled out and in. And this is looking at that sort of structural grid. So you've got your primary structures starting with your core, the sort of those main floors every 3, and then this idea of how you insert the soft floors or even sort of stacked pods within. And this idea that it can, on day 1 when it opens, it can have its own set mixed use, but the idea that you can develop that over time. And so these soft floors can pull out, the core elements can also pull out, it's all accessible. The ground floor is working really hard to just overcome a lot of the complexities on the site itself. And really a big thing in Oslo is that there aren't that many tall towers, but it's got the most phenomenal sort of landscape and environment around it. And so whether you can actually sort of bring a bit of that into the top of the tower as well. And as I was mentioning about the sort of west and east aspect of the city and the sort of the societal impact that it could have as well, this sort of idea of it being a bit of a bridge between both sides of the city, and almost this mixing pot of both, that it's got something to give back. Apologies, this was meant to be a GIF. So if you can all just imagine that this is chopping and changing between the different programs within, but this is the idea that we really wanted to explore ways in which you could create this sort of notion of adaptive reuse. And then just looking at the MEP and servicing and embodied carbon aspect is how you might sort of adapt it over time with these different uses, and that you can kind of, it become a regenerative tower. And a big thing here, which I kind of wanted to just finish on, is this idea of the embodied carbon, and that the superstructure equates on average, at least in this building, to 53% of the embodied carbon. And so if you're talking from the beginning about building something that is permanent, that gives you that adaptability, it means already from the get-go that you're setting up that principle of reducing the embodied carbon. And these are just some images of the scheme in its sort of setting, with that sort of mass timber really celebrated. And yeah, I think I'll finish there. And I just wanted to sort of reiterate, particularly on that last project, is that I think this idea of speculation is really paramount in anything that we're doing, and it's something that exists and you learn and build on at university, but it should never really leave you, because it should be always you questioning and challenging what's happening, so that you can really make a difference and really push things forward, which is really incredibly pertinent right now. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you so much, Jack and Harry. What fascinating 45 minutes. Really so much to dig into. I think, well, we have exactly, not 15, we have exactly 13 minutes. If anybody, and you've got some hand clapping, silent hand clapping going on in the distance there. For any questions, are there any immediate questions? If anyone who has a question, could they raise their hand? And if they don't, I have certainly one or two to kick off, if that's useful. I don't see any hands being raised yet. It may be just everybody being shy. I guess I have one. I mean, I have two sort of key questions, really. Maybe they're not key, but they were the burning questions for me, which one was around the idea of principles, and then the other was really about, you know, what our cities are going to look like. And I so maybe I'll start with the principles one, because it's a word you use a lot. It's a word that I think architecture has sort of strives to hold on to, but doesn't quite hold on tight enough often. And then that idea of what that means when it comes to collaboration, because one thing to have principles of your own, but when it comes to having to share them, that's quite a challenge. And I just wondered, in your process, which was so clearly set out, how does that work? How do you know when you're working with people who are sharing those principles, or how do you ensure that you share them?
Harry, I'm happy to say something, but if you wanted to start,
I can. Yeah, I think it's just a really good question, and possibly is one of the areas where I think the idea of embedding sort of the knowledge and skills from a sustainable or equally the other backgrounds that we were talking about into the practice really helps, because it's true, not everyone does share the same aspiration, and I think that's something that the collaboration element is still really important. And I think one of our roles, or one role that I find, is that it's about sort of translating and often, as Jack said, about questioning what other people's kind of opinions and sort of choices are in the design process. And often that's something that we have to do is about actually trying to push a little bit further, or ask the question and see what the response is. And but yeah, I think honestly that is a really sort of pertinent point, and it's a struggle sometimes.
Yeah, and I'd maybe also. I was just going to say, I think on that is, you know, we can set out and establish our own principles. We all can do that. But it's another thing when you then, and it's not even about collaboration, even a client that you may have that has a very different view. And I see it as, rather than, you know, it's all about a sort of a conversation and trying to reach an agreement. And so if you're able to take a client who would never ever considered, you know, trying to target beyond what is just statutory, say, for example, in terms of an environmental performance, if you're able to sort of educate them, provide evidence, and take them through, you might not get to where you want to get to in terms of say haptics principles, but I think it's still a benefit that we're able to get them closer to that alignment. But it's always a challenge, because it's not just about carbon for clients and for us as well. You know, money is a big thing, and there's lots of things that it's all about education and sort of like being able to navigate that through and really kind of present what at the end of the day is a very straightforward solution.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? Because the conversation in architecture for so long has been around, you know, architecture as a process of compromise. And actually it really demonstrates, I mean, your talk just demonstrates how actually architecture is moving towards, no, it's a process of change, and change in every aspect of mindset towards ambitions, aspirations, as well as process of how to get there. So I never really liked the idea that architecture was all about compromise. So I'm very glad that it's moved to I mean, we finally got to that moment where it's about change. It really is about change in every aspect of what we do. So that's really interesting. And I had sort of made a direct link to that acceleration of learning. So I can see how the closeness of your relationship with academia and the process of, you know, constantly testing these projects in the education and learning studio as much as the professional studio will be helpful for you, because of students coming through and having that. So much of it is a vocabulary as well, I would imagine.
Definitely. I'd even just maybe on that one, you know, if you look at other professions, and this will be far bigger, but research in architecture is fairly small when you consider it, say, against medicine or chemistry. You know, those are researchers at the heart of the way that they work, and there is a little bit of a sort of a separation, maybe not to overstep the mark, but there isn't always an alignment with sort of academia and then the professional world. In historically, I think you can see that sort of shifting, particularly the LSA's approach and model is very different to that. But by bringing those two together, that's really how you get the most out of everything for both people involved.
Yeah, great. I did have another question, but Fabienne Pinot has also got a hand up. So I'm going to go to Fabienne. Are you there, Fabienne? Can we hear you? Your hand is up. Yes.
Hi everyone. Thank you very much for this presentation. I find it really interesting, the collaboration aspect. And I was just wondering about on the client side, if you find a way, I mean, to how you can push on the client side to essentially extend this collaboration, and how it's received essentially, and if you maybe find clients which are able to learn from this process and somehow inform the next projects with you. If you just could tell us more a little bit about it.
Yeah, of course.
I was just going to say, Fabienne, could you just tell us, I should have asked you all this before, could you just tell us where you're calling in from or dialing in from?
Yeah, I can put my video also. I'm an architect. I'm working for a property developer called Eclean. We are developers. We do our own development, and also we have commissions like a normal architectural practice.
Thank you.
Thanks, Barry, for the great. It's a really sort of like interesting topic. To start off, there's a huge range. You'll have clients that are very up to speed, and almost, I would say, sometimes know a little bit more than us in terms of really trying to push forward an environmental agenda, a sustainability agenda. But in terms of when it comes to sort of collaboration, I'll be honest, there are some clients who will look at it and say, well, am I just in effect paying more because I'm employing 2 companies, 3 companies, 4 companies? But really what we, as a model in Haptic in particular, we have worked for many years with many different practices and incredibly successfully. And it comes down to this idea of approaching it from a blended model, that you're, albeit contractually, you'll be appointing kind of an individual company or organization who perhaps may be subcontracting that out or subconsulting it. But the way that you'll see us in our day-to-day operation is that you're talking to us as one. And so if we're teaming up on the Bergen project, for example, you know, everything is being addressed to all architects and engineers involved in that project, and there's an equal footing. And actually on that project, the scale of it, I think they saw the real benefit of having, at the early stages, this collective group that are then able to sort of both kind of bring, you know, that kind of notion of greater than the sum of your parts, that working together, we're able to deliver more and get more out of the site. But you can see the model working later on when it's like designing specific buildings, that can easily be sort of divided up potentially, but they've all stemmed from the same values at the beginning, because that's a collective decision that's been made as a group. I think, you know, any sort of challenges that people that, you know, wholeheartedly can be perceived about that model, our own experience, and maybe we're just lucky, but we haven't really had a bad experience of collaborating over the many, many years of doing it. And I think it's down to that sort of shared values, making sure you're aligned in the first place. Then it's just really kind of exciting to be working with so many great people. So hopefully that sort of roundabout answers it a little bit. But
no, thank you very much for the answer.
Great. Thank you very much. Any other questions out there? No, doesn't look like it. I'm just going to, no, there's nothing in the chat. So I'm going to, I think we have 2 minutes to go. So I think I'm going to wrap up. Beautiful timing. Thank you very much indeed. I had my other question, which was really about what will our cities look like? And I think the one thing, I suppose it's a sort of question which is out there now, which is really interesting to me, because a lot of what you talked about was the technical construction view, the process of making this kind of work. And there is a big part of that which will be what are the sort of spatial tropes and the typologies that it will produce. And you touched on it, Jack, that I wonder whether, you know, what will those types of buildings be in the future? The ones that can be endlessly adapted, endlessly flexible. And that's a very exciting thought, and perhaps I would say a really, really big challenge for particularly students of architecture to be imagining that future. It's very hard to think when one thinks so specifically and technically about it, that there's a sort of sense it produces a certain type of building. And I think that bit of combination of sort of adaptive reuse and then new typology is something you should watch. Wow, there's a telephone. So it's something to watch, and I think it's a discussion which is outside of this one probably for now. But thanks so much for joining us. I will finally say 2 little announcements on behalf of the LSA. Our applications for students for next year, our second round is closing on the 12th of February. So please, if anybody is out there, a Part 1 student who has not put in an application, please do that. So I put that out there. We have our student lecture series continuing this evening. student-led pathways called Optic Translations, which is all about innovative technologies and techniques and storytelling in the world of photography and cinematography. So one to watch, please. That's here in our studio at the LSA in Orsman Road. So you're all very welcome. If anyone is interested in joining the Practice Network, who is not already a part of it, please get in touch with John Nahar, or come and visit. That would be even better. Thanks so much again, Jack and Harry. I hope we welcome you here also in the studio at some point. That would be wonderful.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much as well. Thanks.
Cheerio.